Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazzo.
Hey friends, God bless you. Thank you for tuning in and for sharing the podcast. We've heard from a lot of you in our little mini fundraiser here. We're almost done. A couple more days and we'll be on with another 6 months of quality programming and podcasts. But we have an opportunity to expand our reach with the help of the Pioneer Network, Beck TV, and God's Learning Channel. So if you've not already donated to Worldview Matters and you are able to financially, we ask if you'd consider supporting, and that would be, for example, a one-time gift of $200 or any amount really, of course, or a monthly gift of $25 a month. We would love to send you, just our way of saying thanks, a copy of Alex Newman's autographed brand new book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Or you can get my latest book, Assault on the Image of God, whatever one you'd like. And first-time donors will get this Worldview Matters mug with my tagline on the back: keep speaking the truth about things that matter, and it matters that you do not put this in the dishwasher. But anyway, make your tax-deductible gift at worldviewmatters.tv. We are blessed today to have another brother with us that I've talked to many, many times, and boys, he opened a lot of people's eyes. His name is Scott Schara. He also is known as Grace's dad, and I want to bring him in. He's in the studio right now. So, Mr. Schara, welcome back to Worldview Matters. Good to see you, brother.
Well, it's great to see you too. And I'm going to promote your book for a second because I'm a fan of Alex Newman also, but yours truly, along with my wife, wrote chapter 9, the most important chapter of the book. So you've got to pick David's book versus Alex's. But Alex's is I bought Alex's also. It's fantastic.
Thank you for mentioning that. I don't mind plugging my own book on my own show. But if you're not familiar with Scott, you guys, chapter 9 is all about what he and his family went through when they lost their 19-year-old daughter, Grace. If you're a new viewer or a new listener to the podcast, you might not be familiar with Scott's story, but the website is ouramazinggrace.net. There it is, ouramazinggrace.net. Yes, it looks like a busy website because there's a lot of information. There's a lot of resources. And a word about what you have on the site and the information that people can get, Scott.
Well, at this point, I have 3,500 hours of research in since Grace's death. You know, when you and I first met, I had a couple hundred hours in. And now
you were a rookie then.
I was a rookie. I had everything in a binder, remember?
Yes.
And now it had to be categorized on the website with all these different tabs because it has really become an exposure of the medical industrial complex and how the satanic agenda is behind that entire medical industry.
Well, I'm going to quote an article you just sent me that you recently wrote. COVID exposed the message in the title, and is the diagnosis is the patient.
Yes.
I pray this article will open eyes and hearts to what's going on in the walled gardens we call hospitals. And the very next line, Scott, I'll let you elaborate on this. Talking about his daughter, Grace, she went in with a cold. Hours later, she was on Vapotherm, then a BiPAP. She was dead 6.5 days later. Scott, that's powerful. Take it from there. Just share just the bullet points of the story. I know you've done this many times, but we do have a lot of new viewers.
It's hard to grasp, you know, as I replay things, which we do every single day at home. You can't help but replaying it. My best buddy's gone. You replay this and then compare it to the hospital stay that I had 3 days after Grace died, and you can't help but see what they did. And now we're through the first round of depositions in the lawsuit, and you see what they were doing. They are all in on the COVID narrative, and they're treating the diagnosis. So Grace had the diagnosis of COVID, and that's what they did. They had a protocol to treat the diagnosis. The hospital I went into 3 days later, they had a protocol to listen to the patient and treat the patient. And that hospital turned me around in 24 hours because they did a 180-degree difference than what happened with Grace. In Grace's case, I allowed her to go into the hospital because I was told we'll put her on oxygen and a steroid for 3-4 days as a precaution and then get her out of here. The reality was, if they would have only done that, Grace would be alive today. But they started this process of Vapotherm, then BiPAP. They made oxygen therapy a mini god, and that became an idol that drove almost everything. Well, then, because she was on Vapotherm and then a BiPAP, they used that as an excuse to put Grace on an anesthesia medicine called Precedex. Then they combined the anesthesia medicine with a sedation medicine called lorazepam. Then they combined those two with an opioid called morphine.
Wow.
And that's what you do to euthanize somebody in hospice care in their last hour of life. And, to boot, the doctor put an illegal do not resuscitate order on Grace's chart. So when it came time to revive her, they wouldn't. When you compare that to what happened in my hospital stay, I was on low-dose oxygen through a cannula, a steroid, and then they used budesonide through a inhaler, basically, to open up my lungs. The doctor sat down with me.
How come more hospitals didn't do that?
The only thing that I can say is part of the programming has infiltrated hospitals to follow standards of care. But with COVID, the hospitals were specifically incentivized to do certain things. The incentives, for example, to label somebody as a COVID patient, to write on their death certificate that they died of COVID-19 pneumonia. These things were all incentivized.
And how much did a hospital get per person for those, what you just said?
Well, the average stay was over $100,000, and this is not something I'm just making up.
For one person?
For one person.
The hospital would get
$100,000 in government bonus payments. That's outside of the insurance payments and the regular payments for the room rent, et cetera. So the incentives were, God says the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and the incentives were such that it took what they were already used to. This was set up through standards of care. So what they were already used to, it just, okay, well, the government is saying this. I trust the government. They're the ones who feed me. And so consequently, we're going to follow this model. What still bothers me about it is after, let's say that you and I are a doctor in a hospital and almost 100% of your patients are dying. Well, how long would it take you to start looking elsewhere other than the mandates that were coming down from the FDA and the NIH?
I want to ask you really quick. We've had, thanks to you, Jeff Wagner on this podcast several times. He was the documentary producer of Breaking the Oath. Breaking the Oath. If you haven't seen it, Breaking the Oath. Great documentary. Jeff Wagner is a producer, and he's just a great brother. He's got his own podcast. But he interviewed a few nurses who, I don't know that they kind of exposed a lot, because I don't know how much that got out there, because you don't really hear anything on the major media about this with nurses like the ones that were in Breaking the Oath. Have you heard more stories like that from either doctors, nurses, hospital personnel, administrators, any, since you've been fighting this battle? Have you heard some say, yep, I did it because that's what the protocol was, or I didn't want to lose my job? Have you heard more stories like that?
Sure, I'll give you a couple. One just recently, but it isn't about, so this nurse left, but she's in a hospital setting yet. She's a nurse that is awake. She's in a hospital setting. And just 2 weeks ago, I had contact with a friend of hers. She's likely going to come on my podcast, but she said they had 8 births that day. 3 died at birth, and it was all vaccinated moms. So it is so widespread.
I know like a high percentage.
Oh, it's super high percentage. 8? Yeah, I mean that's unheard of. We know there's a 24% all-cause mortality increase for the jab, but that isn't your question. The one, to be very specific about the question that you have, this bothers me because people knew. There's people that did not know. But an example is a nurse in Appleton. When she heard me speak out the first time, she called the reporter who did the report and said, that man's lying. About 6 months ago, she called that same reporter and said, he's not lying. And the reason she knew that is because she's the power of attorney on her dad, and the doctor in that hospital put an illegal do not resuscitate order on her dad. So with the permission of the reporter, she brokered a phone call. I talked with the nurse on the phone. Wow. And I said to her, now that you know this, will you come on programs with me and share it? Because it's a lot more credible coming from an insider versus just a dad, right?
Yeah.
And she said, I'm 66 years old and I can't do that. I'm too close to retirement.
It'd probably destroy her, huh?
Well, I mean, is your retirement more important than the truth?
And that's the dilemma. That's the question that a lot of people in the medical profession had to deal with. Not everybody was on board with this agenda. Not everybody agreed with the government, but money and their job and security, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes for those that went along with this and helped kill people. Because you said 1.2 million Americans were killed in hospitals during the COVID era. America was the #1 in this category of all countries on the planet. #1. Do we have the highest population? I don't think so.
We have 4.2% of the world's population. We are a country that is hooked on pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
We consume 45% of the world's pharmaceuticals, 4.8 billion prescriptions written annually to citizens of the United States. So we are a pill-happy country. Wow. And so it's no surprise that we are leading the world in this category. #1 in COVID hospital murders. It makes no sense. #2 was India. And India's population is 4 times that of the United States, and their death count is 533,000 compared to 1.2 million.
Numbers don't add up, and that shares a lot about America too, and our government. That kind of speaks volumes. So you have a lawsuit now, and part of that lawsuit, obviously, it's been going forward, and you've mentioned gag orders. You've got a lot of updates since we've seen you last. You've been in court a few times. You've been under deposition, right? So share a little bit for our viewers that don't know anything about the suit, and why aren't more of these suits filed? Because it's just like, it truly is David and Goliath, isn't it?
Yeah, that's an understatement. I mean, you just said a mouthful. So I'll go through the lawsuit first so people can understand that. But then, the more important question is, why aren't more lawsuits filed? So I'll answer that second. Yeah. We filed the lawsuit on April 11th, 2023. The hospital, so we filed against Ascension Hospital System, 5 doctors and 2 nurses. We took that extraordinary step because the goal of the lawsuit is not financial. So think about just that from a perspective. In a civil lawsuit, the goal of the system is to write a check. How do you write a check for a death? That doesn't make any sense. So we did not file for that purpose. We have said multiple times, whatever check they write us, we're not taking, because it's not about that. It is first about the repentance of the people who did this. It's second about stopping the behavior. So if you can stop the behavior of the individuals involved and they repent, we won, lawsuit or not. So we want the entire country to be on notice that you cannot use following orders as your excuse. So we're not just going against the system, the hospital system, we're the individual doctors and nurses. So then they had to respond by May 15th. That generated a couple of motions to dismiss. Those motions to dismiss were heard in July. We filed an amended complaint that generated more motions to dismiss. Those were heard in October. And the judge said the whole case is going to trial, and the 3-week jury trial is scheduled starting November 4th this year.
Wow.
So we are in what's called discovery right now.
Okay.
Discovery ends on September 30th. Discovery includes interrogatories where you do question answer back and forth between the parties. It includes depositions where you are interviewed under oath. And then third includes disclosure and interviews of the experts. So that's coming up. We are about halfway through the depositions. 2 weeks ago, we did the first round. So Cindy, my wife, my daughter Jessica, were both deposed. I was deposed for about 16 hours.
Wow.
It was long. And then we did about half of the doctors and nurses. The depositions, I'll just tell you, these are serious things. I'll tell you one funny story about the depositions, and then I'll tell you one that, they're trying to make you look like a dummy. Okay?
Of course.
And so in one of the depositions, there's a blood chemistry parameter. You're probably familiar with it, called BUN, capital B, capital U, capital N. So I'm familiar with it because I have heart disease, but I don't know what it is. So the attorney, trying to make me look like a fool, said, "Mr. Schara, do you know what organ of the body the bun relates to?" And of course, you know my sense of humor. And it was one of the few times he teed it up for me. So I said,
"The bun?"
I would presume the buns. So then on to another one where they're trying to make me look like a dummy. The attorney said, Mr. Schara, what evidence do you have that the medicines given Grace killed her? And I paused and I said, in the most serious, because it is the most serious answer I can give, I said, she's dead.
What evidence, right?
Yeah, I mean,
and
she's
then
dead.
Your next answer would have been, here, did you read the package inserts? Because on the package inserts, and if you don't know the whole story, and it's in chapter 9 of my book, and ouramazinggrace.net, these 3 drugs should never be given together, regardless of the amount, correct?
Because they're contraindicated. The morphine package insert means that you're not supposed to give them together because they're synergistic. So they gave Grace anesthesia, sedation, and opioid. Gosh. Those 3 are synergistic. It says right on the package insert that it can cause death. And if you choose to combine these, you're supposed to keep the reversal drug bedside and monitor the patient, neither of which was done, because it's that powerful of a combination. It's right on the front page. It's called the black box warning on the package insert. So
this is a crime. It is a crime. And friends, pray for the success of the Scott Schara family lawsuit, for God's favor and just for justice. Pray for repentance, and maybe that'll send a signal across the country and a shockwave. Anyway, we've got to take a very brief pause. We'll be right back with Scott Schara, ouramazinggrace.net.
Introducing Patriot Mobile, the wireless carrier that stands with you. We are committed to supporting the values that make our nation great. With affordable plans and reliable nationwide coverage, Patriot Mobile is not just a wireless service. It's a call to action for those who believe in the American dream. Because this year is not just any year, it's the most important year since our nation's founding. Choose a wireless carrier that shares your values. Choose Patriot Mobile.
Get free activation now with promo code DAVID. If you're interested in sponsoring Worldview Matters, send us an email, worldviewmatters@fpeusa.org, and our producer will get right back to you, worldviewmatters.tv. We're with Scott Schara. Scott, the second question that I asked you was, why aren't more lawsuits like this filed? I think most people kind of understand, can think logically, because it is David and Goliath, but why do you think?
Well, it's much bigger than that. So the title of your show is Worldview Matters. So our worldview matters, and it truly does matter. The legal system that we have in this country is an anti-Christ legal system. It is not meant for justice. Justice, think about what justice means. What should the consequence be if you kill somebody? What's the consequence for medical murder? Well, the walled gardens that you mentioned earlier, what's going on is there's a max. If somebody commits medical malpractice in the state of Wisconsin, there's a limit of $750,000. Number one. So a death is worth $750,000? Does that sound like justice?
No.
Then there's barriers to pursuing justice. So, for example, the barriers for informed consent. If a doctor does not provide informed consent, the barrier is you have to report that your sole reporting is to the medical examining board. That medical examining board is made up of 10 doctors and 3 lay people. So the doctors are their own judge and jury. So, and there's no appeal process. So those are just 2 simple examples. The statute, the state statute, requires attorneys that can only take 1/3 of the proceeds. The best medical malpractice attorneys will tell you that even in slam dunk cases like this appears to be, there's only a 1 in 10 chance of winning. In Wisconsin, we have a 12-person jury. We have to convince 10 of our case to win.
Wow.
So you can see these, I have umpteen barriers, but I'm just touching on the high points.
So the odds are against
the average person from filing a lawsuit.
Okay, you were talking about standards of care. But also in your article, though, you talked about you think some of the depositions contained lies. Not surprising. And it's your word against theirs. But anyway, go ahead and share a little bit about what you sent, because you wanted to talk a little bit about Medicare, Medicaid, and standards of care.
So just very quickly on the depositions, yes, I have documented lies. We ended up entering into a temporary gag order for the doctors and nurses' depositions. They held a gun to our head, wouldn't even let us proceed with the depositions unless we signed this gag order. So we called the bluff. I had 2 of the attorneys already flown in from Ohio, and we just said, okay, you want to do this, you have to file a motion with the judge. We want the judge to decide. The reason is the rule of law comes into play here. A trial should be public. So there's no reason. I mean, what are you trying to hide?
Yep.
Why do you need a gag order on these doctors and nurses?
That's right.
So anyway, we're hoping that, that motion was filed last week. We're hoping that the hearing for that motion happens sooner versus later, because then I can release these depositions to the public and show the lies.
Wow. It's just so sad the hoops you have to jump through, but go ahead.
All right, so standards of care is our main topic that we want to finish with. So standards of care, this idea comes out of, from the 80s. The idea was we need to start controlling medical costs. Well, what's the reason we need to start controlling medical costs? Well, it makes sense. So in a company, we write standard operating procedures. Why? To save time, to save money. So the concept makes sense. But what has happened, as the law of entropy always does, you take something that isn't evil to start with and you add our sinful nature, and the law of entropy takes over. So now we have standards of care that control the entire system. I'm going to give you an example to help frame this.
Yeah.
When I was diagnosed with heart disease 6 years ago, a good nurse came to me because I told her I'm not taking the statin. That was their prescription. You need to get on the statin. I said, I'm not taking it. She said, Scott, you have to. I said, what do you mean?
Wow.
She said, I'm going to tell you something you're not going to want to hear. I said, okay, well, tell me. And she said, you have to take the statin because our Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement rates are based on what percentage of our patient population follow the standard of care. I said, I'm not on Medicare and Medicaid. She said, it doesn't matter. Our reimbursement rates are based on our entire patient population. So if we have enough patients like you who refuse to follow the standard of care, we have to fire you. All right, so now take that concept to cancer. So a person is diagnosed with cancer today. What is the standard of care for cancer? I mean, we all know what it is. You can cut, use radiation or chemo, right? So that's what the doctor is programmed to follow. In fact, he doesn't get paid unless he follows one of those 3 standards of care. And guess what? The insurance company doesn't pay the hospital system unless the standard of care is followed. And what is the patient programmed to believe? We're programmed to believe cancer is the kiss of death, and then we know cutting, radiation, chemo. Well, I've studied cancer since Grace's death and part of the exposure to the medical industrial complex. And I see cancer, for the most part, has been cured, but we're not programmed to know that. So now the patient comes in with that standard of care, with the diagnosis, and the doctor says, well, I can schedule your chemo appointment for next week. And the patient unwittingly agrees and just says, well, my insurance pay for it. And the doctor says yes. And the doctor and the patient sign their death certificate.
Wow.
Chemo, David, has a 97.9% kill rate.
Failure rate or kill rate, yes. I didn't
so that's an example.
It's
staggering. That's the example of how standards of care are hastening death in our country, and hastening death is murder. That's why the series I put together, Medical Murder, is the #1 cause of death in the United States by design.
And that's on your website, ouramazinggrace.net. People are going to be emailing you or going to your website and asking you, what about this cure for cancer? What about this? They have solutions. And there are other options, but people are programmed to do those 3 things: surgery, the chemo, radiation, right? So what else? There was one more thing that we wanted to get to. We just have 3.5 minutes left.
Yep. I want to talk about informed consent.
Okay, that's right.
Because informed consent seems obvious, right? If you and I were a doctor, God wrote the standard of informed consent at the beginning, right? Treat your neighbor as yourself.
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Right, so that would be the standard of informed consent. Okay, that is not happening in a hospital. The things that I listed out for Grace, those meds, we had no idea. So we had no consent whatsoever. That's why we have a medical battery claim. Wow. So informed consent means the doctor's talking to you about the situation ahead of time, giving you pros, cons, strengths, weaknesses, alternatives. educating you. And then your consent is a separate thing. You process, pray, do your own research, and then you give consent. That's not happening.
Right.
And what is worse is it's not happening because the law is on their side. Most people have not heard of the Cures Act. They've heard of the CARES Act. The Cures Act was passed in 2016. The Cures Act was the first act by Congress to eliminate informed consent. And I'm going to give you a very specific thing related to Grace's case. We hired a separate attorney to impart on the local district attorney in Outagamie County to file a criminal case. The district attorney's office wrote back on July 26th of 2023, a doctor is not required to administer treatment he or she believes is not medically effective. This includes authorizing a DNR. The parties clearly had a dispute about how Dr. Shokar should treat Grace. Dr. Shokar did not abide by the wishes of the family. However, there is no law in Wisconsin that requires him to do so.
However,
think that through. Wrap your head around that. So
wow.
You're going into what you consider to be a safe zone, a hospital system.
Well, we used to be able to trust all people in the medical system, and that was a long time ago. And we're not putting a blanket over all doctors, nurses, administrators, but we are saying there's enough of them that know what's going on, or they're following orders or whatever. So your closing thoughts in the last minute and a half.
My closing thoughts are what I always close with. We are being called to operate under Genesis 50:20. We believe that is our calling. And Genesis 50:20, to paraphrase, says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, the saving of many lives, which is happening today. So we talked today about the physical piece. In order to save your life, you have to wake up physically, but spiritually, of course, is way more important. So we'll have to cover that next time.
We will. And the value of life, because this is a worldview battle. Scott mentioned the spiritual nature of this, and the Antichrist nature of the system, and trusting government and everything else. So friends, we're just thankful for Scott and all the work. My goodness. Did you say 3,500 hours?
Yes.
Oh, gosh. All right. OurAmazingGrace.net, or if you have my book, you'll get to chapter 9, where Scott and Cindy wrote that chapter. I helped, edit and put that together and help it flow. Cindy did a wonderful job opening. Scott came in, just knocked it out of the ballpark with the details and with so much information that I think will be helpful to you and your family based on what he's gone through. So, guys, thank you again for sharing the show. God bless you, and as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter.